So this week, I continue with the series on our place in God's world, and it is church and state, politics, citizenship. Our place in God's world politically and in terms of citizens. Now, if you say, oh my gosh, I don't want to hear about that, just remember next Sunday is sexuality. As I promised, it's our place in God's world, sexuality. Politics. You know, politics seems to have a negative connotation these days. You think of swamps, you think of lying, you think of gridlock, you think of self-interest. A better word that's probably more attractive is citizenship. Citizenship still seems to have a positive connotation of involvement and activity for civic good. I think we spend a lot of time on politics, watching cable news, listening to cable news, reading stuff on the website. And I sometimes wonder if part of the gridlock is we get so wrapped up in what we're watching politically that we're almost impotent to do anything. We're almost paralyzed. I wonder if we would be well served if for every hour we spend watching some political cable news show, we spend an equal hour, say, in Bible reading. Or for every hour on cable news, we spend half an hour tutoring a child or visiting in a nursing home. Or for every hour of watching cable news, we spend 15 minutes in evangelism. Now, that would either make the church really healthy or we'd just stop watching cable news. But this is a sermon on church and state. I learned very early in the ministry that ministers, shouldn't get involved in politics, that church and state are two separate spheres. I can't figure out if this is a cold or an allergy. You vote. Put it on the welcome card. That if I said something that someone disagreed with, I would be criticized for being political. And if I said something that people agreed with, I was just a good guy. And I was preaching the gospel. There have been occasions where I've said in sermons that I'm opposed to the death penalty. And I've gotten emails about how political I am and I shouldn't be involving politics in my sermons. I've talked about the support of government-paid health care, and I get emails about that I shouldn't be mixing politics. At the same time, I get emails saying, way to preach the gospel, way to preach the gospel. So it's political if we disagree with it. It's Christian if we agree with it, is kind of my rule of thumb. So, but politics is kind of a gotcha thing for ministers. And the press conference that Jesus has with the Herodians and the Pharisees and the Sadducees is a gotcha question. It's interesting that it says the Herodians and the Pharisees got together and asked Jesus this question about taxes. Well, that would be, the Herodians would be the far right, and the Pharisees would be something of the moderate left. So you could argue that it's like the Tea Party or the alt-right got together with the Clinton supporters to ask Jesus this question. They're odd bedfellows, and they usually don't cross the aisle except to get Jesus. And so this is the thing, to get Jesus. They want Jesus out of the way. So to whom do we pay taxes? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Well, the Romans were the occupying army. They were not well appreciated. They were draining the country. And should we support this alien government? If Jesus says yes, then he alienates all the people in Israel as a Roman supporter. If he says no, he's labeled himself as a revolutionary, and he's sunk either way. In asking for the coin would have the image of the Emperor Tiberius on it. Coins then were great publicity and propaganda. Every time you paid something, you looked at Caesar's image, and you were reminded that Caesar was in power and that you owed everything to Caesar. So when Jesus says, whose image is on this coin, they say, well, Caesar's is. And then he comes out with his famous answer, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and unto God what is God's. And the crowd is stupefied and doesn't know what to say. Usually this answer is interpreted as, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's. And so you have these two spheres, country and God, and there's no intersection. So Caesar has this authority to rule the government, and here's God's kingdom over here that's only concerned with heaven and salvation. And so God's kingdom has no right to interfere in Caesar's kingdom, which is often interpreted as Christians shouldn't talk about the budget, shouldn't talk about health care, shouldn't talk about war and peace, or same-gender marriage, or immigration. That's Caesar's realm, and we shouldn't be meddling in it. We should only be preaching about salvation and getting to heaven. That has been a common interpretation of render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and render unto God's what is God's. Another way of looking at that is when Jesus says, whose image is on this coin? They say Caesar's. The implication is, whose image is on us? Is it Caesar's or God's? We are made in the image of God. So we render ourselves to God, in whose image we are made. And so Jesus is making almost the opposite statement. He's saying that all things are God's, and we are accountable ultimately to God. It's almost like the two circles have been intersected. And we represent God because we are in the image of God. And the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And all things are under God, and things are not separate. They intersect. Now that's a good Methodist interpretation. The Methodists say, we proclaim no personal gospel that fails to express itself in social concerns. So we say there's an intersection. And we proclaim no personal gospel that does not express itself in the transformation of people. So the Methodist Church will say there is an intersection of God's world and Caesar's world. And the Methodist Church will make statements in the social principles on the death penalty and torture and war and peace and domestic surveillance. So where does that leave us as Christian citizens? Well, now we deal with Romans 13, the passage where Paul says we are to be obedient to the state because the rulers are appointed by God and act under God's authority. I did a paper on this when I was in college. I pulled that paper out. It's stunning. How many of you have saved your papers for 45 years? I felt so sorry for my professor having read that thing. I don't know why I still have it, but I pulled it out. It was pretty good, actually. But one of the things I said in the paper, that passage about obedience to the state and authority being given to our rulers by the state, by God, is tempered by the times in which anybody is writing. So in the 16th century, this notion of the two kingdoms was pretty popular. During other times, the notion of civil disobedience became it was a great influence in how that passage was interpreted. I've noticed that there was an article in the Dispatch Friday where they were talking about this passage on the religion page, and they said that many right-wing Christians are saying that this passage gives the American government a God-given right to bomb Korea or any other country, because we are to be obedient to our rulers, and our rulers do what God says. Whatever they do is what God says. That was kind of a disturbing interpretation of Romans 13. I find that my interpretation is also tempered by what's going on in our country and what's going on in our community, how we understand our obedience to civil authority. When Paul writes about civil authority and being obedient to it in Romans 13, he's writing to a church that understands that it's saved by God's grace, not by their works, not by their morality. And so some of them are operating on what my New Testament professor called the whoopee theory. God saved us by God's grace. Whoopee, we can do whatever we want to. And so we don't have to obey the law. And Paul's writing in Romans 13, so no, you do have to obey the law, because the law is good, and it creates order, and it creates civility. I find that when I read Romans 13 about obedience to the state, I read it in the context of chapter 12, where Paul talks about Christian behavior in the church. And he says, hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Let your love be genuine. Do not be haughty. Live in harmony with all people. Seek what is noble. Pray for those who persecute you. Bless your enemies. Weep with those who weep. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Do not seek revenge. But if your enemy is hungry, feed your enemy. If your enemy is thirsty, give drink. It's in the context of that behavior that Paul is writing about obedience to our authority. And I think he's saying, as you behave with fellow Christians, you behave with other people in society. You behave with those who disagree with you as a Christian. You let your Christianity shape how you are as a citizen. It is God and country, not country and God. And I think, how often do we let our politics shape our Christianity rather than Christianity shape our politics. That saying, my country, right or wrong, is never quoted in its entirety. It's my country, right or wrong, when right, to be kept in the right, when wrong, to be put in the right. That's the full quotation. Does our Christianity bring that eye to our citizenship? It's interesting that I read an article in Atlantic this winter about the lack of civility in our political discourse, in our communities, in our legislatures. And the writer, I would not call Atlantic a Christian magazine, so I'm always eager to read praises of Christianity in secular literature. And the writer said one of the problems that she saw with the decline of civility in our nation can be correlated to the decline in church attendance. That there is a decline in the left in church attendance, and there is a decline in the right in church attendance. And it shows up as a lack of civility. Remember what Paul says about be not haughty, but be humble, and seek the noble in all things. Let your love be genuine. Pray for those who persecute you. Bless your enemies. What if that were taken into society? I read several essays by Martin Luther King this week on citizenship. And I think he's still worth listening to for our citizenship. He says, a just law is that which is moral and that which uplifts human personality and human dignity. An unjust law is not moral, and it degrades human personality and human dignity. And he says non-compliance with an unjust law is as much as of a moral obligation as is compliance with a just law. And he goes on to say, in faced with an unjust law, we can do three things. One is to comply with it. Just bend over to it and let injustice reign. The next thing we can do is resist it violently. That can be in our speech, that can be in our behavior, that can be in our thinking. The third thing is to resist it non-violently, not comply with it. He says both the violent resistor and the non-violent resistor understand that suffering is very powerful. But one wants to inflict suffering, and the other wants to absorb it. He goes on to say that the nonviolent resistors, the nonviolent citizens, have the hope and the belief that their enemy has a spark of good and decency in him or her. How often do we experience that in civil discourse today? That the other side sees the spark of good and potential in their enemy. Then he talks about resisting an unjust law. 4 steps. And I'll just do them briefly. 1, get your facts straight. Don't deal with emotion. Don't deal with feelings. Know what the facts are. It's good advice. 2, negotiate. Once you know your facts, negotiate with the other side. Talk to the other side. If that fails, step 3 is self-purification. Whoa, how rare is that? He says, look inward. You might want to do violence outwardly, but are you full of hate? Do you pray for your enemy? Are you willing to suffer for justice? Purify yourself inwardly before you act. That seemed to be a step that's frequently skipped. And then 4 is direct action. Do not comply. I think those first 3 steps for citizenship are so good. Know the facts. Negotiate. Purify yourself initially. Now, I've got to say that in the end, Jesus and Paul might not give us much help. Paul ends by saying, so pay reverence to those whom reverence is due. Leaves it up to us to determine to whom reverence is due. Pay taxes to those whom taxes is due. Pay revenue to those whom revenue is due. Give honor to those whom honor is due. We have to decide that. And Jesus, in the end, leaves it up for us to decide where the realms, the kingdoms, intersect and how we should act. I think Christian citizenship begins with looking at the world around us and saying, somebody ought to. Somebody ought to do something. Somebody ought to say something. Somebody ought to do something about all the trash in the alleys. Somebody ought to do something about illiteracy. Somebody ought to do something about immigration. And so somebody does something actually tangible, helps a refugee, tutors a child, picks up trash. And then from there, once the involvement happens, somebody says, well, why are children illiterate? Why is this trash here? Why are there refugees? And then it ratchets up to maybe going to the school board, maybe going to the principal, maybe going to city council, maybe looking at the laws and why things are the way they are. And it just gets more and more involved. That's citizenship. And that's politics at its best. King ends his essays often by saying, we're not called to be law-abiding. We're called to be love-abiding. We express our citizenship in the world by being love-abiding. God so loved the world that God gave God's only Son. We are made in the image of God to show God's love in the world. And that's our call as citizenship, to show God's love in the world. May it be so.